All right, good morning, everyone. So if you're at home today, this is the video that you're going to be watching. It should be fairly short, just to cover some of the types of bias that we might see depending on the type of sampling procedure that we picked that we talked about yesterday. Now, one thing that is important here to understand at the very, very beginning is that even if we pick a good sampling technique, right? So if we pick one of those three quote unquote good methods that I talked about, so a simple random sample, right? A stratified sample or a stratified random sample or a cluster sample, right? This does not free us from bias. It helps to minimize bias. However, it does not free us totally from having bias in our sample. Our goal in terms of any of these things, our goal always is to minimize bias in a given scenario. So again, the idea being that even if we picked the best thing, right, the best simple random sample, the best stratified sample, whichever we chose, there was still going to be some bias in that study regardless. We do our best to minimize it by picking one of these good methods, but it isn't totally gone. And that's an important concept to understand because the AP exam will ask you questions about it, and so it's important to pick the one that has the right wording of minimizing as opposed to preventing. And we'll do some examples of that in class, just so we get an idea about what those look like. Now, without further ado here, to talk about our first kind of bias, the very first kind of bias is called non-response bias. And it's as simple as it sounds. All this is when people don't return your survey or don't answer to whatever question you've asked, right? So the idea being people don't answer. So, for instance, a very common example of this would be if you get a survey mailed to you. If you get a survey mailed to you, the odds that somebody's going to answer that, fill it all out, and then mail it back in are fairly small. So oftentimes this is where that's seen. Another good example of this is the math survey that you've taken maybe the past 3 years. Right? There are definitely times when you answered it, and there are definitely years potentially where you didn't. But I can tell you from a teacher perspective that every year we haven't had every student answer it. Most of the time we get somewhere between 800 and 1,000 responses, even though, we have roughly 1,400 math students every year. So this is a good example. The thing is, and the reason why it's considered bias, quote unquote bias, is that we don't know how those people would have responded. We actually cannot quantify the impact that this has because we don't know how they would have answered the question. We don't know which group they would have been in. So as far as understanding what this does to your data, we don't really know, but all we know is that it affected it because I mailed out 1,000 surveys, but I only got back 100. This is the easiest type of bias, I think, to recognize, just because it's literally going to be inherent in the question of you send out 500 emails and only 25 people respond, right? What's the most prevalent type of bias here? So I think this one is pretty easy. Going forward now, the second most common type of bias is the opposite of that, which is response bias. And what this is essentially people are lying, I think I spelled lying there correctly, in their answers. So you're sending out a survey and people are returning it, but they're not answering truthfully. And so the way that we try to minimize this is that we carefully word our questions. we try and phrase questions in the most generic way possible so as not to convey that we want a certain answer. A really, really good example of this is the 2016 election, right? Based on every poll that ever existed, people thought Hillary Clinton would win, right? And then she didn't. So there were a lot of articles at the time that talked about how people, when asked in the polls, gave the wrong answer, right? They said they were going to vote for a certain candidate, but then in actuality, they did not end up voting for that person. So that's a good example of response bias. The idea with carefully wording your questions here, it's important and it seems kind of silly, but the idea is if I word a question in a way that makes it very, very clear my particular stance on a topic, you are more likely to answer it the way that I may want you to answer. So for instance, right, if I asked you a question of, you all recycle, right? Because you know that it's really bad for the environment if you don't recycle and I start to convey some emotion in that question, you may just tell me yes that you recycle every single day, even though that may not actually be the case. So we try to word our questions as generally or as non-emotionally, so to speak, non-biased as possible to make sure that when people answer that question, they're answering it as truthfully as possible. Another way that we try to minimize this is that we make surveys anonymous, right? You don't have to give me your name. If you notice, when you actually take the math department survey, it does not ask you for your name, nor does it collect your email address. That was something that I actually advocated for, because otherwise, how could we expect you guys to answer some of those questions truthfully if you knew that I could go back and look through that spreadsheet and find your answer and know what you said about your math teacher, about how you felt about the assessments and how you felt about homework and everything like that. So those are two very important things that we do to try and minimize response bias in our surveys. Now, again, it's impossible to totally get rid of this. Absolutely 100% impossible, because I'm never going to know if the person who's returning my survey is actually telling the truth or not, right? If this was an election survey and I say that I'm going to go vote for candidate A, but then when I go to the polls, I actually vote for candidate B, no one is actually going to know that. So again, we do our best to minimize it. The last type of bias here is called underrepresentation, or sometimes it's seen as selection bias. My stylus doesn't want to work right now. It's okay, I'll figure this out. It's okay, you get the idea. There's no I, there we go. Selection bias. And what this is, again, very similar to the actual name, right? This is systematically, I shouldn't say systematically, it's just leaving out a portion of your population. And so a very silly example of this, but I think a very pertinent one, would be if I was going to try and forecast who was going to win an election, but I only surveyed members of one political party. If I'm trying to figure out who's going to win the presidential election, but I only survey Republicans, odds are my survey results are going to end up with Donald Trump winning the election, right? If I survey both sides, right, Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, everybody, right, and members of every single party, I'm going to get a much more complete picture of how to forecast this thing and how to, make an estimate. But the idea here being, if you leave out an entire portion of your population, then your results are going to be biased. So again, the way that we try to minimize this is a very simple thing. We just increase our sample size. So to try and make sure we have every group represented, I just increase my sample size, right? I'm going to survey more people. Hopefully then, I make sure I have a significant portion of each group represented. The other important thing to understand is that these three things are not mutually exclusive, meaning it's possible to have non-response bias, and therefore, because of that, I end up with some selection bias or underrepresentation in my study. Now, I will say you can also have non-response bias and response bias in the same survey. You may have a large chunk of people who don't answer, as well as a chunk of people who don't tell the truth in their answers. So it's not that this is going to be one of these three. For the most part, it's going to be a combination of all three. It's just a matter of which one is going to be most prevalent. And so to give you an idea about what type of question you might see that involves bias, we're going to take a quick look at this question here. Now, in case you're wondering, this question is from 2004. It's also from Form B. So if you wanted to go ahead and take a look at the actual scoring guidelines. So it's 2004, Form B, obviously question 2. So if we read quickly here, certain universities, students who live in a dormitory, they eat at a common dining hall. Recently, some people have been complaining about the quality of the food. So the dining hall manager decides to do a survey to estimate the proportion of people, right? So this is a good example, right? Estimating that proportion is that parameter that we talked about yesterday. So the proportion of people who are dissatisfied with the food, right, or think the quality of the food should be improved, that's the parameter that this dining hall manager is trying to estimate. His population here is the people who live in these dormitories. Right, so his population isn't every college student that ever existed, it's just these specific ones at this specific university. So he sends out this survey, yes, no, no opinion. The key here is he gives it to the first 100 people to enter the dining hall. So you can say, right, here, for part A, right, if we look at part A, in this setting, explain how bias may have been introduced by the way of this convenience sample and suggest how it could have been selected differently. So the idea here is maybe the people who are entering this dining hall first, maybe they're the people who have a very busy day, they're not too worried about the food, many of them are going to answer no opinion. Another important factor here is that the dining hall manager handed it out, right? So this person, so let's make some notes here. So the type of student who's first in the dining hall, right, may not be representative of the entire population of these dormitories who eat at this dining hall, right? The other thing that's important is that the dining manager is the one handing out and collecting these. So we may have some response bias here, as he's an authority figure and people may not want to make him upset, right? So this would be my selection bias. The type of student who shows up first may not be representative of the entire population. Suggesting how the sample could have been selected differently, there are an infinite amount of right answers to that question, right? Maybe we stratify by time of day, right? I'm going to sample 30 people, 33 people at breakfast, 33 people at lunch, 34 people at dinner time, right? Or maybe I do a simple random sample, right? Where I'm going to generate a whole list of random numbers, and those are going to be the people that I select throughout the day. Maybe I do a cluster sample and I can divide the dining hall up by table and select entire tables to give the question to. Right? So there's a multitude of right answers to that particular question. And then B, in setting explain how bias may have been introduced by the question was worded. Right? So the key with part B is talking about that part that I just underlined, even though that would increase the cost of the meal plan, is that now it's giving students an incentive to say no, because now there's a consequence to their answer. So this may introduce some response bias because there is a consequence to answering yes. So this is just a short, quick example, just so you get an idea. Next week when I see you all, we will do a lot more free response questions as it comes to this bias and sampling techniques, because oftentimes they are grouped together in the same question. So I'm just going to leave you a short worksheet today that's going to ask you to just identify some sampling techniques, just some really basic stuff. And then don't forget, your quiz on linear regression is tomorrow. So I will see all of you tomorrow. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye, guys.